Hello, I'm Katty Kay in Washington, D.C.
And I'm Carlos Watson in California.
And welcome to When Katty Met Carlos,
a new podcast that looks at the ways the U.S. is reshaping its future, brought to you by the BBC World Service and OZY Media.
We're recording this program on Thursday, the day after the shocking events on Capitol Hill. So, Carlos, what a week. Normally, we would digest everything that has been happening, but there has been so much going on and the world has been watching. I'm sure our listeners are up to date with the latest. Congress has signed off on a Biden victory. Congress was under siege. There is talk of transfer of power, but possibly trying to stop President Trump sitting out the next 10 days of his presidency. We have a great discussion lined up looking at all of this and looking at the future of what happens in America. So I think we should jump straight in.
We should. In fact, here are a couple of sounds from the past few days to get us started.
We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved.
Extraordinary scenes here with thousands of people all around this building, all around Capitol Hill, more and more getting onto the Capitol grounds.
That's right, guys. That's the message. These guys better fight for Trump, because if they're not, guess what? If you're going to be the zero and not the hero, we're coming for you, and we're going to have a good time doing it.
At this hour, our democracy is under an unprecedented assault, unlike anything we've seen in modern times. An assault on the citadel of liberty.
The report we make is that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will be the president and the vice president according to the ballots that have been given to us.
You know, it's been a really tumultuous few days here, and at the end of 4 tumultuous years of the Trump presidency, where does all this leave Donald Trump? Where does it leave the Republican Party? And maybe just as importantly, what can we expect from President-elect Biden as he tries to heal what are obvious rifts here in the country?
And a big question hanging over all of this, have the events of this week exposed fault lines in America's democracy? Joining us on today's show are Ron Christie. He's a former policy advisor to both Vice President Dick Cheney, and he was a special assistant to President George W. Bush in the White House.
And also joining us is Doug Sosnik, who's a former senior advisor to former President Bill Clinton.
Welcome to both of you. Doug, let me jump in with you as a former senior advisor to Bill Clinton in the 1990s. I know that you've spent a lot of time both in the White House and on Capitol Hill. When you watched the events of yesterday, what was going through your mind?
Well, I think for most people, it was really heartbreaking. It was really shocking to see in our country people storming the Capitol in a violent way. And I think it really is a symptom or a reflection of what's been going on in our country now for a generation, which is a decline in faith of institutions, the divisions in our country. I don't think Trump caused these divisions, but I think he's exploited those divisions. And it really put on full display, I think, right now at least, the state of America and the divisions in our society.
Ron, how do you see what happened yesterday, and how do you think about where the president goes from here?
The notion that the president of the United States would stand before a group of his supporters and say that he hopes that the vice president does the right thing, which is, of course, to not certify electors from certain states, which the vice president can't do under the 12th Amendment of the Constitution, and then say that the action will happen on the Hill. It's almost like you're inciting people who thought they were going to come to Washington for a miraculous conception victory for the president, get angry and storm the Capitol when they didn't get the result. So for all the good that the president may have done with tax cuts or with making inroads with communities of color, I think this will be a stain that will forever tarnish his presidency.
Yeah, I mean, Ron, one of the things I thought was so striking was the image of the American flag being taken down and the Trump flag being raised. And for me, that was emblematic of the president's support base. It's all about him.
It's all about him, Katty, and you noticed that with those just really graphic pictures that we saw, photos from yesterday, almost all these folks were waving Trump flags, not the American flag. And so it really denigrates the purpose that they claim that they've come to reclaim democracy. They came to honor one man, and our country is better than any one leader. We are the United States of America.
They also, if we're talking about flags for a minute, there were also a lot of Confederate flags that they were waving yesterday as well.
And so, Doug, I've heard a number of people say to me, hey, look, it is not a surprise that the president has been this kind of person even before he was a candidate. No surprise here. And that to some people, the biggest surprise was that the Capitol Hill police allowed it to happen and weren't better prepared and didn't respond differently. How do you think about that element of it, that a bad situation was allowed to escalate way beyond what should have happened?
Well, I worked in the House and the Senate for 12 years, and I'm very familiar with both bodies as well as the Capitol. And there's obviously was an enormous breakdown of security yesterday. But I think in the broader point to your question, obviously speaking as a Democrat, I'm continually surprised that I've been surprised by what Trump has done for the past 4 years. I expected the worst, and he's far exceeded what I expected. And every time he does something that I think is bottom, he proves to me a week or 2 or 3 weeks later that he could go lower. So again, I never, ever expect him to go as far down as he has gone. And I keep being surprised that I'm surprised.
I keep hearing this phrase about the Trump presidency that we are shocked but not surprised by some of the things he did. But yes, I've covered American politics for 20 years, and I was floored by what I saw yesterday. I mean, it's the kind of thing a lot of us who have been foreign correspondents have seen in other much more fragile democracies. Ron, I know that you speak to people who are inside the White House. What's your sense of what's going on in the White House now? His mood, what he's planning to do, what his staff around him are saying to him?
I found it very interesting, Katty, to read this morning that the First Lady Melania Trump's chief of staff resigned, the deputy press secretary resigned, the social secretary resigned. I get the sense that there's a lot of disbelief as to what's happened ever since the election, the defiance by the president to concede the election that he lost, and they were hoping, for many of the people I had spoken to, that he would go out on a bang, just not this way, and that he would reposition himself for 2024. But from what I'm hearing from people who are still there, they're just in great disbelief that he has acted this way.
Ron, how do you think about, as someone who served in the White House as well, you've seen a number of people resign, you've seen a number of people waver, you saw fewer Republicans object than who originally said they were going to on the Senate side. But in the end, enough Republicans are still staying with the president, 8 senators, a number of members of the House. Are Republicans just going to let the next 13 days pass and then try to move on? Or do you think there will be a larger confrontation with the president, maybe even a split in the party, as some have suggested?
I think that the inability of Republicans, particularly in leadership, to stand up to the president's antics over the last 4 years, they're really now paying dividends. There are a lot of Republicans on either side of the chamber who are fearful that any disagreement with the president will find themselves in a position where they get a primary opponent in their next election. So I think you're going to find over the next 13, 14 days, Republicans resolve to the fact that he's headed out the exit. But it does, as your question poses, bring up a broader conversation that needs to be had of what do we stand for as Republicans, or is it just the party of Donald Trump?
But Ron, I mean, I was watching Fox News a lot during the events of what was happening up on Capitol Hill, and it was interesting to hear Fox kind of basically jump off the election was stolen bandwagon pretty snappily and call the president out. And I wonder whether the events that we saw, the images that we saw up on Capitol Hill have pushed things so far that in a way it might take the wind out of the sails of Trumpism. And has it gone too far? Will we now see Republicans feel they can get elected and distance themselves from those images?
Well, that's just the very question, Katty. I think Republicans are going to have an honest conversation within our party and say, do we stand for Donald Trump or do we stand for conservative values and principles? And I don't think Trumpism is going to die. I think these folks who
You think he's still just as powerful even after what happened this week?
With his base, yes. I mean, you remember he famously said he could go down Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and they'd still stick with him. Well, a lot of these folks stormed the United States Capitol, and I think that they're still going to stick with him.
So, Doug, what does that say about Democrats? I mean, certainly the Representative-elect Cori Bush from Missouri, she would argue in part, and I think some of her other fellow freshmen, Jamal Bowman from New York and others, are going to say that part of the reason why Trump has done these things is because Democrats haven't been even more confrontational, and that, frankly, it's a mistake for President-elect Biden to think that he's going to be able to work with Mitch McConnell and others. Do you think that third way, that kind of Clintonian effort to build bridges, is going to be a mistake, and that, in fact, it is a new world in which Democrats will have to be more confrontational given the president's sway over a large number of voters?
Well, let me take the broader context for a minute. I mean, we're going through a historic period of transition in our country. We haven't seen the likes of which since the late 1800s when we moved from a agrarian to an industrial society. So we're going through a transition right now where our 20th century institutions are incapable of dealing with our 21st century problems. And so as a result of that, 7 out of the last 8 elections have been change elections. And so our country right now is not really voting for something as much as voting against whoever's in power. And we had a presidential election in which 47,000 people in 3 states determined who was president. We have a United States Senate that's going to be 50-50. We have a United States House where one party has a majority of only 5 members, which is the smallest amount in 20 years. So we are a divided country right now in which we are really not in a position, and I don't think anytime soon, to resolve the direction and future of our country. And so I think we're largely going to be at this political standoff until we're able to sort through this period of transition into a 21st century digital and global world in which our institutions are able to function on behalf of the American people.
So what can Joe Biden do then to try and do anything to make America governable again, frankly? I mean, how do you've got to have some conversation between the two sides if you want to get anything done. That's the way the American governing system works. You can't rule on a parliamentary basis. He hasn't got the majority to do that anyway. And in order to get people talking to each other, they can't do it just in Capitol Hill. They've got to do it throughout the country too. How do you begin that conversation now? 45% of Republicans in one poll say they agree with the storming of the Capitol.
Well, look, we're going through this transition and the parties are realigning. And there's basically, much as you're seeing in Europe, I mean, the demarcation lines in many ways now are the populists on one side and the oligarchs on the other side. And so that transcends some partisan traditional lines that we've seen. So there are areas, I think, like stimulus money, like infrastructure investments. I believe in China, by the way, and how we're going to deal with China, going after the tech companies, drug prices. I think there are areas of commonality. So I think those are areas that Biden can work on and that Republicans, many of which will embrace. So he will be able to get some things done.
And Ron, talk to me a little bit about the Republicans and where they go from here, particularly if not only does the president post-inauguration continue to mount a protest and be active there, but if there are more protests in the streets from other people, if you see more Black Lives Matter protests and others, where do you think Republicans go from here, and who in particular do you expect to step up in a meaningful way over the next 6 months?
You know, it's really interesting, Carlos. I think that so much of Trumpism has been a repudiation of the moderates and those who are willing to cut deals with the Democrats. And as I look at what's going to happen once the president leaves the stage, is people like Mitt Romney and Susan Collins, both senators, both moderates, reaching across the aisle to try to find consensus with the new administration as well as with their fellow Democrats. And so I think what you're going to see is there are always going to be the Trumpians, the Ted Cruz types of the world. But I look at the more pragmatic people like Marco Rubio, even Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy in the House, trying to find ways to forge solutions rather than to continue to throw bombs that we've seen for the last 4 years.
It's very rare for me to be Pollyanna-ish on this program. I'm usually the one who is the voice of pessimism, not optimism. But I wonder whether we aren't going to see some kind of reassertion of the value of competency and actually a diminution of populism, because for two reasons. One, that Trump has actually not done very well. I mean, this has been a bad week for the president electorally. He helped lose 2 Senate seats in Georgia and hand the Senate majority to Democrats. He's lost the House of Representatives, he's lost the Senate, and he's lost the White House. So I wonder whether Trump as a political force is looking as powerful as he was even a few days ago. And more globally, the handling of the pandemic has made people want some kind of expertise, some kind of competence in government. And maybe that's a way forward for Joe Biden. If Joe Biden can deliver basic services of good government and competence to people, both economically and in the handling of the pandemic, could we see some of the lancing of the boil of these more extreme elements in American politics?
Well, I don't think the populist engine, I don't think that is going to cut down. If anything, and I think COVID is exasperating the divisions in our country in terms of the people in power and people with money and people who don't have power and don't have money. And Trumpism, the dirty little secret about Trump is he almost got reelected on top of all his problems. And the fact is that a lot of his policies were popular with people. And a lot of his policies, you're going to see, by the way, that Biden's not going to change. So I don't think the populist movement is going to slow down. If anything, I think it'll even increase. I do think that competency is an issue in our country because all our systems, people think our systems are either broken or they're corrupt. And the two worst things to happen on competency in government in the last 15 years in America, one was the Obama administration's failure to be able to stand up the healthcare site and the policies, and the other was 4 years of Trump. And so I do think that expertise is something people are looking for, but we're going to be in the land of delayed gratification. First of all, people aren't going to believe it until they see it. Secondly, in order to have competency and be able to show it, you're going to have to get in there, fix the problem, which I think is going to be greater what Biden's inheriting than what they think based on the last 4 years internally. But they're going to go in there and they have to become competent, and people are going to have to feel the competency, see the competency and how it affects their life before they're willing to change. And that's going to be a very long process.
Ron?
You know, I look back at American history, and you look at the election of 1876, which was quite contentious. And what did we get out of that? Katty, Carlos, and Doug. We got the Great Compromise of 1877, which, among other things, it ended Reconstruction. And I just wonder, as we look at this election, whether the victory by Joe Biden will lead to a new Great Compromise, will lead to a new way forward for this country, because the kinetics, the antics, the tweets that we've seen over the past 4 years have really animated people, and they're looking for competency and they're looking for normalcy, which I think is what we all would like.
I think at the core of our problem is that politicians act what is in their self-interest. And right now, our political system and structure is rewarding both Democrats worrying about the left and Republicans worrying about the right for their political survival. The current political system and structure, the reward system right now, does not reward or encourage working together. And unless and until that reward system changes, you're going to keep having these divisions from the left and the right, unless these are issues like the populist issues I mentioned earlier that are actually in the self-interest of their constituents, regardless of whether they're Democrats or Republicans.
Hey, Ron, let's close out with both of you talking about the last 10 days here. What do you see happening? Does Trump go quietly into this good night? Is Pence effectively running the government up until then, or will there continue to be a tempest in the teapot? I'm sure I'm butchering metaphors, but you understand the question.
I do. I don't think Donald Trump has the ability to go quietly into that good night. I think that he will continue to say that the election was rigged, it was stolen from him. I genuinely don't even know whether he's going to show up, candidly, for the inauguration of his successor, who he has refused to concede the election to. Mike Pence has kept a remarkably low profile. He defied the president's calls for him to not certify the election, and I would have to say that Mike Pence leaves the administration as certainly one of the people to beat on the Republican nomination side in 2024.
Doug, you get the final word here?
Well, I think that after 4 years, I think nobody should be holding their breath that Trump's going to change or he's going to pivot. And I think the dirty little secret about Trump is he's not at all strategic. He is tactical. He wakes up, he's like a day trader. And so I think for the next 10 days, he's going to wake up and do everything possible to maximize his final days in office, rewarding people, punishing people. He will never acknowledge that he lost the election. I would be very surprised if he showed up on January 20th when Biden takes the oath of office. And I think most of the country is going to be holding its breath for the next 10 days until he exits the stage.
Well, you both have lived through transitions from one administration to another, from one party to another. You know how it should operate. It is pretty clear this one is not going as the founding fathers envisaged it would go. Doug Sosnik, who was a senior advisor to Bill Clinton, Ron Christie, who was a senior advisor to George W. Bush, thank you very much for joining us this week on What a Week It Has Been.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Katty, so what do you make of this? Where do you think we are headed?
I'm really torn between thinking the problems are so deep and fundamental in terms of division. And I keep going back to, and I think I've said this to you before, Carlos, what Bob Gates, the former defense secretary under Barack Obama, once said to me, which is that America faces three national security problems: China, Russia, and itself, by which he meant the political divisions. And we have had those on display this week. And I think the events of this week really have shown the fragility caused by those divisions in this country: racial divisions, political divisions, cross-party divisions, and the glee with which the people were invading the Capitol and feeling jubilant, feeling that they had, had this moment, that there's nothing remorseful about any of them. They were thrilled with what they did. And that makes me think, they may well try again, having enjoyed the experience so much. And between thinking maybe it went too far, and the American people will have watched those scenes and been so horrified by what they saw that they will want to return to centrism and normalcy and a leadership that promotes peace and calm and a bit more cooperation in the country. And maybe we are seeing the lancing of the boil of that extremism. And I don't know which way it goes. I think we are entering a moment of some peril in the last days of this transition process. And perhaps that will give us an indication of what happens next.
Yeah, I do think endings, whether they're endings of romantic relationships or of companies or of campaigns or of administrations, are often a very destabilized, not very stable situation. I think this one, sadly, is likely to fit into that. You know what's been interesting to me, Katty? On one hand, I spoke to a very senior Republican yesterday who told me, all in all, he thought democracy had been tested. A vice president had stood up to his president. A Senate leader in Mitch McConnell had stood up. Yes, there had been a handful of U.S. senators and members of the House who had objected. But all in all, he actually saw this as a good test. I suspect we'll hear more of that in the coming days. But I have to tell you, Katty, that when I speak to one African American after another, whether it is a school teacher in Atlanta, whether it's a member of Congress, whether it's a CEO, one African American after another in the last 24 hours cannot get over the difference between how white protesters, Trump protesters, were treated versus what happened to black protesters or even just black people. And I think it is going to have a very deep, visceral, profound impact. I think the 2020s will be the new 60s. And I think that you are going to see a very strong reaction, marching and other things by many black Americans who I think are just saying it is too clear that there's a disparity in treatment, and trying to go along and get along or to try and heal and bridge, they're going to be like, not really sure that I see a path for that. So I think that'll be an interesting challenge for the whole country, including President-elect Biden.
Yeah, because the question is where that goes. If the feeling is there is no point trying to get along in a system that was built on and for cooperation, how does that work? And you're right. I mean, my kids, the only thing that they were talking about last night when we were having dinner after I got off air, after the sieging of the Capitol, was the disparity in treatment between the Black Lives Matter protests in Washington and what they saw yesterday. And their conclusion was, if you are a white man, and particularly if you are a conservative white man, because it might have been different if that was a big crowd of white progressives. I wonder if they would have been treated the same. But if you are on the kind of Trumpian side, or if you are a white man or a conservative white man, and it was 90% white and overwhelmingly male, that crowd, you're right that it was every African American I've spoken to has picked that up, and most young people I've spoken to have picked that up too.
You know, one last note, and I hate ending on this note because, you know, I'm an optimist at heart, but I had a conversation
I thought that was my role this week.
And you performed it terrifically, I have to say. You did it with great aplomb.
Just thought I'd surprise you, Carlos.
you know, and it's a new year, a new us, and so it is good. But I'm ultimately optimistic on this American experiment, but it certainly has been tested, and I think it certainly will get reset. And I think, man, the conversations, Katty, I think we are going to be a part of over the next couple of years, I think will be profound. And I think it won't just be about race, but I think it will travel the spectrum.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of When Katty Met Carlos, a co-production from the BBC World Service
and OZY Media. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review, tell a friend, and of course, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you, and we'll talk to you again soon.